for Caesar's campaign. The Gauls were united under a legendary warrior chief called Vercingetorix. For Julius Caesar, this is the moment of truth. He surrounds Alesia, but he's taken by surprise when Gallic reinforcements attack from behind. Caesar must now fight two armies at once.
He basically conducted a siege in two directions. Now, what other ancient soldier would have done that, or what soldier today would have had that degree of self-confidence in his men and self-confidence in his own leadership ability to conduct essentially a siege in two directions 500-600 miles from home? That's the mark of a genius.
He's outnumbered 5-1, but Caesar's troops eventually win the battle, capturing the infamous Vercingetorix. It was the last stand for the Gauls, and it made Julius Caesar one of the two most powerful men in Rome and the world. The other was a general and politician named Gnaeus Pompey, long a rival of Caesar's. The ambitions of these two men would soon launch Rome headlong into a bloody struggle for her own survival. It was never a raging torrent or a great river, but it was destined for a place in history. Its very name has come to mean a boundary and an irrevocable decision. The Rubicon. For Caesar, at first it was simply the southern boundary of his province in Gaul. It would soon become a great deal more. The Senate recalled Caesar to Rome, but ordered him to leave his legions behind. He was between a rock and a hard place. He had to go to Rome, but if he went unprotected, he'd almost certainly be murdered by Pompey's supporters. He believed he had no other choice but to call on the loyalty of his men.
He turns to his troops and says, "I'm being insulted by the state. Do you think this is a good thing? Protect me, defend my position in society." That's what the troops were marching for. At least that's how Julius Caesar put it.
It was a high-stakes game of chess, using real armies. In 49 BC, in bold defiance of the Senate, Caesar took his army out of Gaul across an unassuming little stream.
We can still turn back. But once we cross that little bridge, we will have to fight it out. The die is cast. Julius Caesar.
The moment his army crossed the Rubicon, his intent became obvious to all. Caesar was marching on Rome into civil war. The army of one Roman general against another, legion against legion. Caesar defeated Pompey, but the bloody struggle for power raged on. Even after Caesar was stabbed to death by the Senate in 44 BC, civil war and anarchy tore Rome apart. For 2 decades, Romans by the thousands died by Roman swords as one general after another entered the fray. Agrippa, Lepidus, Dolabella, Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, and Cleopatra against Octavian, until one man emerged triumphant. He called himself Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Republic was dead. Rome was now officially an empire, ruled by a sole dictator. The army at last had a single commander, and Rome at last had peace.
The imperial army under Augustus, the first emperor, took an oath of allegiance, not to the Senate, not to the people of Rome, but to the emperor personally, a personal oath of allegiance. The emperor provided the pay, the emperor provided the land that veterans could expect to get after service. So the army was tightly bound to the person of the emperor himself.
For a time, Augustus solved the crisis of the army's loyalty by making himself the sole commander. Rome's first emperor understood that you had to control the military to control Rome. The growth of the empire had slowed, but defending the vast borders was a gargantuan and expensive task.
What Augustus sensed was that simply that the Roman Empire had spread too far too fast, and that the military was stretched to the limit in trying to defend that huge expanse of territory. So he paused.
For perhaps the first time, Rome begins to realize that her expansion is not limitless. In his will, Augustus himself warns future rulers about the dangers of too large an empire. Roman territory continues to increase in the 1st century AD, but at a far slower rate. Augustus added Egypt and extended the northern border to the Danube. The Emperor Claudius finally added Britain in 43 AD, but lost some ground to later uprisings. Rebellions in the provinces were becoming far more frequent. More and more voices of dissent were rising from cultures who despised Roman tyranny as never before.
The Romans are deadly. Pillagers of the world, they have exhausted the earth by their indiscriminate plunder. A rich enemy excites their lust for wealth. A poor one, their craving for power. Robbery, butchery, and rape, they call government. They create a desert and call it peace. Cagagus.
In 66 AD, one relatively minor uprising in far-off Judea would come to haunt the great Roman Empire. A minor religious sect called the Jews rose up against Roman tyranny, passionately resisting Rome's pagan religion. Jewish rebels took control of Jerusalem, then Judea and Galilee. It took 2 years for Rome to reclaim all but Jerusalem, and 2 more years before the legions ruthlessly took back that city as well. Roman troops burned the sacred Second Temple of Jerusalem and rampaged through the streets, carrying off holy treasures.
They massacred all who fell in their way and burned the houses along with all those who were hiding inside. Soldiers ran swords through so many that they choked the streets with the dead and deluged the whole city with blood. So great was the flow of blood that it often actually quenched the flames. Josephus.
By 74 AD, the Jewish cause seemed lost, and yet one last group of rebels refused to surrender, holding out in a mountaintop fortress, a spectacular stronghold 1,400 feet above the Dead Sea, Masada. Entrenched atop this mountain, 960 determined rebels looked down on an entire legion of 5,000 Roman soldiers. The haunting outlines of their camps can still be seen today. The Roman forces were experts at siege warfare, relying on catapults, stone throwers, and firebrands. But the natural fortress of Masada proved too steep for siege weaponry to do much damage from the ground. Using thousands of Jewish slaves and their own soldiers, the Romans started building an enormous ramp of stone and dirt to the top of the mountain. Even though construction would take nearly a year, the legions knew that time was on their side.
It was a very dramatic, slow, meticulous, well-engineered campaign that sought to demonstrate to everyone in the area that the Roman army simply couldn't be beaten.
Four years after the fighting began, the ramp was complete. Romans bombarded the fortress and set it ablaze.
The Romans returned to their camp with the intention of attacking their enemy the next day, and throughout the night kept a careful watch in case any of them should escape in secret.
But there would be no final battle. In a sense, the Jewish zealots did escape defeat and death by